Hello everyone. This is the first of two video parts wherein we'll be doing a little bit of background work about Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is the text that you will read for Friday. The first part of this two-part series is going to be some background on Ovid, but also on Virgil, because it's really hard to understand Ovid without at least knowing a little bit about Virgil. And then the second video will just briefly be a summary of the themes and each piece of the text that we're going to encounter in the Metamorphoses. So let's dive on in. You may want some note-taking materials as you watch this video, just to get a little bit of that kinesthetic action in. You don't need a textbook right now. You just, if you're watching this before you read the stories, you might want it anyway. So before we get to Ovid, we got to talk about Virgil. They were both Roman poets. But Ovid is responding to Virgil directly in his story, so we really got to talk about Virgil first. So we're moving forward in time again to the BC AD changeover. Virgil was not just a Roman poet, he was the Roman poet. He was considered the most foundational, central figure of Roman literature, and we're going to see why. So he wrote the Aeneid, which is a Roman epic to rival Homer's works. It's written also about the Trojan War and its aftermath. It has a hero named Aeneas who was from Troy. And it has a ton of similarities to Homer, both in the form. It's an epic, just like the Iliad and the Odyssey. It has so many similarities, in fact, that really we have to just admit that it's a Roman epic that's cribbing from Homer's works. And Virgil did this on purpose. During and after the Roman Civil War, from 49 to 45 BC, the new imperial system needed ways to legitimize its authority. So after Julius Caesar dies, we get, the Civil War kind of between Augustus Caesar and Mark Antony, and there's that whole big thing in, Egypt with Cleopatra. Augustus takes power individually, and now he needs ways to make the Roman Empire seem good. Because the Roman public is still very divided. A lot of them still support the Republic, some of them support the new empire, but there's so much division that Augustus needs to find ways to bring everyone together, and quickly. So Virgil was able to provide one avenue of legitimation by writing the Aeneid. So what Virgil does is he reworks Homer's Iliad and Odyssey to create a Roman origin story that encouraged support for the new imperial system, and he does this in several ways. So Aeneas himself was a soldier of Troy, kind of this sort of princely figure, who managed to escape the sack of the city, carrying his father on his back and holding his son by the hand. So this emphasizes his desire to establish a familial legacy and a cultural legacy. Aeneas gets contrasted to Achilles, who, if you remember, doesn't really have a family. He doesn't have a wife and kids. He's not going to leave a cultural legacy. All he's going to leave is the legacy of his own heroic deeds. So Aeneas, by contrast, is a family man, and he also cares really deeply about the duty that he feels to his country and to his people, which are very Roman values. So his life is unhappy. He encounters, tragedy after tragedy, but he knows that through all of it, if he can just get his family to a safe location to start, a new culture, his legacy will be safe. So again, this touches on this Roman ideal of duty over personal happiness. You are always trying to do your duty to your family, to your country, etc. So ultimately, Aeneas ends up founding what will become the city of Rome. And on his way, he sacrifices everything. He's in Carthage for a while. He falls in love with Dido, the queen of Carthage, and he knows that he has to leave her. And when he does, she's so distraught that she dies. She just dies of heartbreak. And Aeneas is very sad too, but he believes that he has other responsibilities. And so the story of this man who was so dedicated to his family and to his people that he left Troy and founded Rome would have had this really strong effect on the Roman imagination. And in fact, it really worked, and it worked on the Romans in a number of ways. So first of all, it gave Romans a shared history to create a sense of unity. So the idea was that, Aeneas left Troy and founded Rome, which means that Rome is founded on this, very kind of manly ideal of fatherhood, and he does his duty to his people. And so no matter whether you were on the Republic side of the conflict or the imperial side of the conflict, all of a sudden you had this new shared history that really kind of exemplified everybody's ideals as Romans. So now they have something in common. It also created a sympathetic hero who kind of operated in a more imperial sense than a republican sense. Aeneas being sort of this princely figure, when he founded the city that would become Rome, he did so in a more imperial fashion, which gave Augustus and the kind of empire system a way to say, well, it worked for Aeneas. That's how we got Rome in the first place, so we can make it work for us too. And then the last thing it did was a little bit more nebulous, but what it did was that the characters in the Aeneid often exhibit this sense of nostalgia about their past, even as they very staunchly move forward into their futures. And this gave Romans at the time an avenue to do the same thing. It gave them permission to look back on the Republic fondly, even as they were adjusting to the new empire. It gave them permission to say, gee, that Republic was great, but, I guess I can get used to this empire thing. So it gave them a real sense of permission to both miss the past and be excited for the future, just like good old Aeneas. And then finally, it did draw some direct links between Aeneas's history and Augustus's history. Virgil, was not super subtle about kind of comparing Augustus and Aeneas and kind of making them both seem the same kind of heroic. Aeneas reminds a lot of people of Augustus for good reason. So ultimately, the Aeneid was kind of propaganda, because it was actively trying to further this imperial project by basically inventing a new origin myth for the Roman people. So the Aeneid was often held up as the Roman epic, but Ovid was interested in doing something a little bit different. So we're going to talk about Ovid now. The Aeneid was considered to be very much the height of Roman literature, because it exemplified all of these great Roman ideals, duty, family, blah, blah, blah. But Ovid had a different idea. So Ovid was born in 43 BC, lived until 17 AD. With one exception, we're firmly in the AD years now. So while Virgil was living during the Roman Civil War, and he often kind of wrote in response to it, and it very much seems to have shaped his worldview as a writer, Ovid was too young to remember that turmoil, and that shows too. Ovid writes in a much more optimistic way. He writes much less gravely and seriously about some current events and about his outlook on the world. Mostly he wrote about love, and he didn't just write about the kind of idealized Roman love that's very kind of duty bound and family focused, and we're a husband and a wife having babies in service of the empire. Ovid mostly wrote about romantic love in all of its kind of messy glory and tragedy, no matter what form it took. So Augustus did not take kindly to this, because he was a very moralist, moralizing emperor. And so because of some of Ovid's work was not looked kindly on, he was exiled to the edges of the empire in 8 BC, specifically to what is today Romania. So pretty far out from Rome itself. So let's talk a little bit about the Metamorphoses and just what their structure is. And then we'll end this video, and then in the next you can get some work on some info on the themes and the summaries of the stories that we'll read. So the Metamorphoses themselves are written in epic style, just like the Iliad. They're written in dactylic hexameter. Ovid specifically contrasts to Virgil. In fact, in the first book of the Metamorphoses, he says that he wants this book to be something new. And because of that, he spends at least as much time playing with different narrative techniques as he does actually telling stories. It's kind of amazing. We get a ton of narrative techniques that you don't see a lot before Ovid, or that you don't see experimented with in the way that Ovid experiments with them. He loves frame narratives, so like stories embedded within other stories. He loves pairing stories so that they are kind of in direct conversation with one another thematically. He loves finding ways to connect stories in different, using different methods. He likes the idea of like using flashbacks, flash forwards, moving around in time. So he's really playing with storytelling in a way that we don't see a lot before Ovid. So he wrote the Metamorphoses as a series of mini epics that are all tied together in some way thematically. So that's something else kind of new and interesting that he's doing, where there are 15 books, kind of like the Iliad has books, but he's writing each book as if it's almost a little epic in and of itself. The Metamorphoses are also split up thematically into 6 sections. Each section deals with a different topics or types of stories, and the title itself really is the key to the story and to the text overall. Everything in the book deals with a metamorphosis, either literally, figuratively, somewhere in between. Sometimes people literally change, they change shape. You know, both gods and mortals, some of them become animals, some of them become, trees, constellations, or back into people. They go from being statues to being human. There's a lot of physical changes. There are a lot of figurative changes where people will change their mind, they'll have a change of heart, they'll become different people, kind of personality-wise. There are some times where like people lose their memories and so they change because of that. And then there's some stuff that kind of does both. It's really, really cool. And then finally, Ovid the narrator shows up in the story a lot. And it's really important to not confuse Ovid the narrator with Ovid the author. Because what Ovid is doing is something that you see a ton of in medieval texts, where he creates a narrator who will walk the audience through the stories. But because the narrator is a character, the narrator is allowed to say and express things that the author in real life cannot. So the narrator has a lot of leeway in terms of what he can talk about, how he can talk about it. You see this in the Canterbury Tales, you see this in the Divine Comedy, later in time. And so when you're reading the text, whenever you see Ovid the narrator show up, it's just really important that you remember that Ovid the narrator is just as much a character as anyone else in the text. And when you see Ovid show up, it's not the guy who wrote the book. It's a character that he created so that he can, once again, play with the structure of the text. So in the next video, I'm going to talk just really briefly about some summary and some theme stuff. So do tune into that next video. We're going to pick up right where we left off.